You know, in the world of the NFL draft, momentum is absolutely everything. You've got guys who just skyrocket up draft boards, others who build up that hype nice and slow. But then there's that third group, and they're the ones we're diving into today. The players who start to slide, not because of some huge sudden drop off, but because the more you really dig into the film, the more you look at the data, the more that initial shine just starts to wear off.
And it usually starts right here, with the data. A quarterback's passer rating, which once looked totally elite, starts to seem just, well, good. A receiver's yards per route run number, a key stat that was at the top of the charts, starts sliding back toward the average. It's this slow erosion of the statistical case that made them a top prospect in the first place.
Then you start to see it on the field. You know those wow plays that filled up their early highlight reels? They become fewer and farther between. That huge leap in performance that everybody was expecting to see, it just kind of plateaus. And all that early hype starts to feel like a distant memory. And that's exactly when the real deep dive begins. So today, we're going to put on our scout hats and break down 5 big-name prospects from the 2026 class whose data is starting to raise some pretty serious red flags. So let's get right into it. Why is it just as important to understand a player's fall as it is to track their rise? We're about to find out. First up, we've got a quarterback who came into this whole cycle with a ton of hype, Quinn Ewers. Look, nobody's going to deny his arm talent. The guy can make every single throw in the book. But the deeper you dig into the numbers, the more his inconsistency becomes this glaring issue you just can't ignore. And honestly, this slide tells you everything you need to know. It shows the two sides of Quinn Ewers, plain and simple. On the left, when he's got a clean pocket, he's elite. I mean, completing over 75% of his passes. But look at the right side. When the pressure gets there, that completion percentage just plummets to under 50%, and his turnover-worthy play rate is hanging around 5%. For a top QB prospect, that is a huge, huge red flag. So here's the bottom line. That massive gap between Ewers' incredible flashes and his week-to-week consistency, especially when things get messy in the pocket, is exactly why his draft stock is being looked at so carefully right now. Okay, let's switch gears from the guy throwing the ball to someone who could be catching it at the next level, wide receiver Emeka Egbuka. For a long time, he was seen as one of the safest bets in this whole class. But here's the problem. He isn't really separating himself from the pack anymore. Yeah, the hope was that he'd develop into a true #1 receiver, an alpha. But the data, well, it tells a different story. His yards per route run is right around 2.0, which is good, don't get me wrong. But it's not that elite 2.5 or higher that you see from the true first-round game-changing talents. He's just not consistently getting open and dominating the guy across from him. And this right here really captures that dilemma. On one hand, you've got a solid, dependable piece of the offense. But what teams are really looking for with a first-round pick is a player who can just take over a game, a guy who electrifies the whole unit. The concern with Egbuka is that we're seeing a lot more of the solid contributor and not nearly enough of the game breaker. All right, let's flip over to the defensive side of the ball and talk about a player who is a classic scouting puzzle, pass rusher Dallas Turner. This is that ultimate traits versus production debate. We're talking about a player who looks like he was built in a lab to get after the quarterback, but his impact on the stat sheet doesn't always match up with that eye-popping athleticism. And you can see that exact conflict right here. On the left, you've got this explosive athlete who can just bend around the edge with incredible speed. But on the right is what scouts are seeing way too often on film, a player whose impact just seems to fade in and out of games. His pressure-to-sack conversion rate? It's just lower than you'd expect for someone with his kind of physical gifts. And that's the whole problem, right? While his ceiling is still through the roof, all these questions about his consistency are actively hurting his draft stock. Teams need guys who are going to show up on every single down, not just for a couple of series here and there. Sticking with the defense, let's talk about a cornerback who came into the year with a ton of buzz, Kool-Aid McKinstry. But as the season's gone on, a deeper look at his play is starting to reveal some cracks in that foundation. See, he has this reputation as a lockdown corner. But the numbers, they're telling a bit of a different story. Quarterbacks targeting him are completing over 60% of their passes, and he only has a handful of pass breakups and just 1 interception on the year. For a guy hyped as a top corner, you just expect to see more disruptive, ball-hawking plays. So the consensus is kind of building around this idea. McKinstry is a solid cover corner, for sure,
but he might not be that shut-down island or the elite playmaker that all the early hype suggested. He feels more like a guy who will prevent big plays rather than a guy who will create game-changing ones for his own defense. And finally, let's take a look at defensive lineman JT Tuimoloau. Now, here's a player with just undeniable top-tier physical tools. He has moments where he looks like the single best player on the entire field, but that key word there is moments. The biggest issue is just plain old consistency. This chart really tells the whole story, doesn't it? His production comes in these massive bursts. He'll have a game where he is completely unblockable, just takes over, and then it's followed by several quiet games where his pressure rate and his overall disruption are surprisingly low. And that right there, that creates a ton of uncertainty. It brings up the biggest question you can have about a prospect like Tuimoloau. Can he be a consistently impactful player in the NFL, week in and week out? Or is he always going to be a guy defined by these incredible but occasional flashes of dominance? Now, we have to be really clear about something. A falling stock does not mean a player is a bust. Not at all. All 5 of these guys have the talent and, importantly, the time to turn things around and answer all the questions that scouts are asking. But this really gets to the absolute heart of the NFL draft process. It's not just about a player's raw potential, what they could be. It's about their projection, what the data and the tape suggest they will be. And when those two things don't line up, you better believe NFL teams take notice. So now I want to kick it over to you. Looking at the guys we talked about, or maybe even some other players you've been watching, which prospect do you think is on the fastest slide right now? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to see who you all have your eyes on.